Hi everyone, my name is Greg Falco and I'm a security researcher here at MIT. I completed my PhD with Professor Suskind in critical urban infrastructure cybersecurity. Currently I do things like break into the electric grid. I look at policy levers to reduce the security incidents for critical systems. I look at risk management systems for critical urban infrastructure, and a number of other things I probably shouldn't say publicly. Today, what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about is the different lines of attack for critical urban infrastructure. And specifically what we're going to cover is what are the top attack vectors? Where are the weaknesses in these attack vectors? What makes things particularly bad for critical urban infrastructure? How do attackers choose the vulnerabilities? How do they exploit these vulnerabilities? And what do attackers do once they've actually exploited the vulnerability? So to start, what are the top attack vectors? And I think that, generally speaking, the number one problem with the attacks are people. People are the weakest link. And the reason for this is because when you have a critical urban system, there's many people who are working as operators or facilitators or managers of those systems. And they have special access to those systems. But they're not generally very conscious about the security posture of what they're working on. So it's pretty simple for an attacker to solicit that information and try and understand what they need to know just by asking someone else. That's a huge issue when it comes to critical urban infrastructure. The second attack vector is really suppliers. It's a reality that most critical urban systems don't do everything themselves. They have contractors, they have vast supply chains of parts and components, and these suppliers have special access to these systems. So an attacker can ostensibly partner with or break into a supplier organization and then extract information from the critical urban infrastructure organization through that supplier entity. And perhaps the most obvious attack vector is through the technology itself. And when I say that, I mean there's digital systems that are underlying most of our public infrastructure. And these digital systems have bugs. They have vulnerabilities inside them. And so it's very fair and easy for these attackers to try and go figure out what's going on with them and break into those systems. Specifically because they use commercial off-the-shelf technology, COTS technology, you might hear. And that's where you might buy a technology somewhere in the store, and everyone has equal access to the technology. So an attacker can also buy that technology and figure out the vulnerabilities that are in that system, and then just apply that knowledge directly to your urban infrastructure. Think about Windows, for example. Everyone has Windows on their PCs. Well, critical urban infrastructure also uses Windows. And that's why attackers have a lot of access to this. So where are the weaknesses in these technologies? Well, specifically, I would say it's in the fact that we have legacy technology out there. Legacy technology really means that these systems have been built over time. And the fact that they've been built over decades and decades means that they've been having replaced parts. They have systems that are no longer in use. They have systems that are no longer, they don't have companies that support them anymore. And when that happens, you can't really update that technology because maybe that vendor went out of business. And so you can't really keep these systems in check from a security standpoint. And that becomes very challenging when you're trying to actually secure the infrastructure as a whole. When you have all of these different pieces of your technology from different vendors that might not be around anymore. And so what makes things particularly bad for critical urban infrastructure? And I'd say that generally it's a challenge, A, to manage all of the disparate digital systems that are in the infrastructure. So the fact that you have a whole bunch of different vendors that have made different parts, and you might not even be aware of the software versions that are in those parts to be able to go update them. And the fact that you have a lot of interoperability challenges where you have integration between different components. And that integration also has vulnerabilities. So it makes it very difficult to understand what your problems are. So how do hackers choose a vulnerability to go after? And the reality is that they look for the path of least resistance. Because why try and spend a lot of time building their own exploits and finding their own vulnerabilities that are very difficult to find when they can have equal impact on very low-hanging fruit, especially with the case that urban systems generally do not have a whole bunch of security experts on hand that are updating and fixing all this technology as there are problems that arise. So how do the attackers exploit the vulnerabilities? Well, usually using existing exploit kits. And these exploit kits are either open source and available online. You can go find one today in a tool like Kali Linux, which is a suite of different exploit tools. Some buy exploits on the dark web, some buy them from nation states, and some are just leaked from government organizations. For example, in the US, the urban infrastructure has been attacked from ransomware recently using a series of NSA exploits that were leaked. And this causes huge issues because these exploits apply to vast amounts of systems. So what do attackers do once they have access and exploit the vulnerability? Well, usually they have very clear goals in mind for what they're going to do once they get into the system. But afterwards, they either try and get out and make sure that no one ever knew that they existed and be very stealthy, or they persist in the network and they hide there, waiting to attack next time. And this causes a lot of challenges as well, because we don't know if they're there anymore. So for critical urban infrastructure, there are many different lines of attack, or as we say, attack vectors. And there's no silver bullet to solving it. And so that's why we need to be aware of all of the players, all of the different types of attackers, the different ways they try to break into our networks, and also what they might want to do once they're there.